It's the week ending Friday the 23rd of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the sinking of the super yacht Bayesian in Sicily with tech tycoon Mike Lynch on board, Oprah Winfrey, Barack and Michelle Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton and Lil Jon boosting morale at the DNC, and the death of Sven, one half of the world's most famous gay penguin couples at Sea Life Sydney Aquarium. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is Leaf Arbuthnot. We welcome back climate journalist Jessica Hullinger and book reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. I don't have Lil Jon here to read out your names, but I always do my best. And actually, if you could choose a rapper to do your roll call, Leaf, who would you choose?
Oh my God. Well, probably I'll just go for, what's it called? Slim Shady.
Eminem. Wow,
Yeah.
Big booking.
Yeah, sorry.
I like it. Going big. Jess, who would you have?
Oh, God. This is a horrible question. I don't really listen to rap, so I'm going to decline to answer for fear of sounding completely ignorant.
Unusually self-aware there. Well
It's
done.
a diplomatic answer.
Mariana, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are orangutans up for grabs?
It's a new term at the world's most remarkable school for orphaned orangutans. Everyone's raring to go.
Bumi!
Well, almost everyone.
Bumi!
Bumi is late and is messing around as usual.
Oh, Rumba.
He's one of 240 rescued orangutans learning how to live in the wild.
A clip from Orangutan Jungle School, posted on the YouTube channel of the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation. I wish we could just talk about orangutans, but the story's a bit more complicated than that. Mariana, what is your orangutan story of the week?
So earlier this week, the Malay Plantations and Commodities Minister announced that companies that import palm oil from Malaysia will be able to adopt orangutans, but the animals will not be able to leave the country.
Palm oil and orangutans, how are those two things connected? I don't understand.
So this has been called the Orangutan Diplomacy Scheme, which was first made public in May. And so the animals were offered as trading gifts to allay concerns about the environmental effects of the growing commodity. So palm oil requires a lot of deforestation and so on, which then impacts the habitats of the orangutans in Malaysia.
Okay, so the attempt was for the Malaysian government to say, we know that you don't like deforestation for palm oil, but you're buying palm oil, so don't worry. We're going to give you an orangutan. I still don't understand how those things are connected.
So sort of. So it's a sort of like reputational issue. And so the Malay government said that if you're importing oil from us, so major trading partners such as the EU, China, and India, if you import palm oil from us, then you are up or you're sort of eligible to adopt a orangutan. They haven't mentioned what the cost is, but the funds that they acquire from this adoption scheme are then distributed to non-governmental organizations and to the government, and then they're used to monitor the forested areas where the orangutans live, and then also to fund further habitat conservation work, such as building corridors between fragmented forests that are too small to sustain the current wildlife populations.
Okay, Jess, this sounds like greenwashing, doesn't it? Take our palm oil, but don't worry, you're supporting our native wildlife.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about this, but it seems like, let's say if we take the orangutans out of the equation here, let's say there's no, quote, adopting. Like, this is a voluntary program, right? If you buy and import palm oil from Malaysia, you don't have to then adopt an orangutan. You don't have to give money to these organizations that are going to be protecting these habitats, supposedly. So it sort of sounds a little bit like the carbon offset market, right? Where like companies can buy carbon credits to sort of offset their environmental damage elsewhere, with the idea being that they are funding sort of reforestation or habitat rejuvenation in other countries, but it's highly unregulated. It's hard to monitor. The transparency is low. Like it does completely reek of greenwashing. I think that the orangutan is just sort of supposed to be a cute cover up for what's actually happening.
And palm oil itself, Leaf, I mean, it's quite good just to put that in the spotlight briefly, because I think a lot of us have a general idea that it's harmful to the environment to use so much of it, but it's in many, many things. And it is, isn't it? It's the fruit of the palm tree.
Yeah.
Is then in just like millions of products.
It's in extraordinary numbers of products. The Guardian said that trying to determine where palm oil is requires almost superhuman levels of kind of consumer awareness. So you can try and attempt to avoid obvious kind of sources of palm oil. For instance, it's famously in Nutella, but then, you know, as you're eating your digestive, instead of your Nutella sandwich, you're actually eating palm oil as you do that. And not only in just food that you can consume, famously it's in some lipsticks, it can be in kind of, you know, just beauty products.
Palm olive, I presume.
Well, yeah, I presume. I don't actually know about that one, but no. I'd be surprised. It's not a very good brand name now. The interesting thing about palm oil, one of the many interesting things about it, is that the more you dig into it, the more you see that there were kind of like positive and good reasons to take up palm oil. It was seen as quite a kind of poverty alleviator in the countries that produced it. And also in the sort of second half of the last century, people started finding out more about the unhealthiness of kind of animal-based fats. And so people wanted to transition to vegetable fats. And palm oil eventually was kind of taken up as one of the good ones, partly because it's really cheap. But of course, as with all these things, you know, you think that something, it's a bit like with plastic actually, you think something's a kind of miracle product, but then there's a dark side of the moon, as it were. And so, yeah, it's just really difficult to avoid it now.
And of course, it's a really important commodity, Mariana, for Malaysia, isn't it? I mean, it's their major agricultural export.
Yes, so Malaysia is the world's second largest producer of palm oil, which means that its economy relies heavily on it. It's also a really important part of its trade relations with India, one of its major trading partners. It's also the other side of the coin, the reason why Malaysia is at the rate of 54% of deforestation. And so I think the orangutan diplomacy also came with this pledge that they will bring it down to 50%, which is still an incredible number. And there's this regional watchdog, Rimbo Watch, that conducted some surveys on how much of the leftovers of the forests were actually safe. And between deforestation and palm oil production, there was about 16%.
Can you just talk me through, Jess, briefly, why you can't just plant more trees? Why isn't it sustainable? I mean, I appreciate, obviously, that, you know, you're talking about stunning forest in Malaysia, and that would take centuries to grow back, but something can grow back, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an argument for sort of planting more trees. There's a climate issue there, which is that, like, first of all, trees take a long time to grow, obviously, and they will take ages to be able to sort of harness the carbon emissions that they have the potential to do so as they grow. There's also a climate angle here, which is that it's not just about trees. It's also about there are these peat swamps that get drained in order to plant palm oil crops. And when those are drained, they release huge amounts of carbon emissions. There was one study in 2020 in the journal Nature that found that converting peat swamp into palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia contributed to 0.8% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's equivalent to almost half of what the aviation industry puts into the atmosphere every year. So it's not just about planting trees. It's also about the environmental damage in terms of like habitat, right? So like, yes, you can take out these trees and say, we're going to plant more, but you're also ruining habitat for lots of animals. I mean, crucial ecosystems for not only the orangutan, but lots of other wonderful species. So yeah, you could say, well, we'll just plant more trees, but it's sort of a more systemic problem than that, I think.
I guess you could also say, Leaf, if you're trying to put a positive spin on buying palm oil from Malaysia, that you're supporting poor farmers. And if you withdraw that support, then those people aren't going to have anything to live on. And that's more important, you might think, than supporting even the infrastructure and the wildlife.
Yeah, and the evidence does suggest that the uptake of palm oil has kind of lifted a lot of people out of poverty and kind of led to, you know, rising populations and things like that. So there's a very strong argument. And I do think we kind of pick and choose environmental concerns, and charismatic animals like orangutans get a lot of time, really sort of work on the emotions. But then, as we say, like no one's thinking about the peat swamps, and surely there are like, interesting animals and sort of insects that live in peat swamps.
Peat swamp diplomacy.
Yeah, sexy. We're all tongue.
Yeah.
I find it really difficult because sometimes, it's just easier just to sort of shrug it all off and be like, oh man, this is really complicated, palm oils and everything. I am but a mere little consumer, going into Tesco and trying to, not spend too much money in the cost of living crisis. And I haven't really come to a conclusion with all that. Like, I'm just as arbitrary as the next person. As I was saying, like, I don't have Nutella anymore. I have Bonne Maman, which is actually delicious, that spread. I recommend it. The hazelnut spread.
Overheard in Waitrose.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I do buy it on offer, but still. And yet, I can't be bothered to look at the ingredients of everything. And because it's so ubiquitous, I'm sure I'm having way more palm oil than I think. There was a figure in 2015 that kind of alarmed me, which was something like we consume 7 kilos of palm oil every year. It's quite an old figure, but that's a lot. That's 7 kilos. That's, if you think of 7 bags of sugar, shocking amount. So we're all eating it. We're all putting it on our hair and on our faces. And it leaves me with a feeling of slight despair, I must say.
And it's being done for our convenience, Jess. That's the other thing. Or I suppose for our purse strings. If you don't want to spend too much money on products, especially if you're a big importer as a supermarket, you can buy these palm oil products and they're cheaper. But there are alternatives. There's no need for us to be eating so much palm oil.
There are alternatives. I mean, palm oil is extremely versatile in terms of what it can be used for. It's popular for a reason. It's affordable, and it also has incredibly high yield. So you can plant less of it compared to other oil-producing plants and get much more of it, right? So there's more bang for your buck. And in a way, that actually makes for an interesting argument about whether or not boycotting it or banning it or whatever. Aside from the livelihood downsides that it would mean for the farmers, it would also mean that switching to other oils would mean more land loss, right? Because you have to plant more of them to get the same amount of yield, vastly more. And so there's been this push among organizations, including wildlife organizations, saying like, we don't want to boycott because that would have huge downsides. What we want to try and do is support sustainable palm oil production. And that's tricky. Again, you have issues of transparency. In 2004, there was this group called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil that was formed, and it's a voluntary certification scheme. It's a global scheme. It's supported by lots of producers, lots of buyers. But their whole thing is that in order to get the RSPO certification label that you'll see on products in supermarkets, you can't participate in deforestation. But it's tricky because in order to qualify for that, you have to contain a minimum 95% of, quote, sustainable palm oil. So that leaves 5% of palm oil that could be unsustainably farmed, right? So it's tricky. I mean, there are attempts to make it sustainable, but it's similar. I think Leaf mentioned plastic. Like, weaning ourselves off plastic is really hard because plastic is particularly good at what it does. It's a wonderful product. It helps us in lots of ways. So it has lots of downsides as well. So trying to wean ourselves off of it is very difficult.
Okay. So back to the orangutans then, Mariana. I obliquely referenced China's panda diplomacy a moment ago, but that's how you see this adopt an orangutan plan. It's Malaysia's attempt at animal diplomatic gift giving. Talk us through the history of that as a meme.
I think it's the best kind of combination. It's a very niche international relations meets furry animals, and I feel like I'm very comfortable talking about it just because it's a lot of fun. But no, it was actually the Malay commodities minister who likened the orangutan diplomacy to China's very famous panda diplomacy. So in the case of the pandas, the panda diplomacy has a long history. It has been dated back to the Tang dynasty over 1,000 years ago. There's been research carried out from Oxford that tries to chart how China's gift giving and also recalling of pandas is associated with China's soft power.
So we lost some pandas from Edinburgh Zoo, didn't we, a few years ago? And that was China asking for them back.
Please do not remind me of that because I just moved to Edinburgh this year and the pandas were recalled last year. So 2 of the pandas were recalled. A few were recalled, I think, from the US as well. But the US just got 2 new ones. So there's all this back and forth with the pandas. And I think one of the reasons why the pandas were recalled from the Edinburgh Zoo was that relations with the West were particularly rocky at the time. So very much the conservation efforts are associated with China's projection of its soft power, but also it has given pandas before to Malaysia after the very famous incident with the airplane that crashed over Chinese airspace.
Okay, but pandas are rare. That's why you're upset that you can't see them. Orangutans, I mean, I appreciate they're under threat, but there are orangutans in Western zoos already, aren't there? So what's the excitement of orangutan diplomacy here, do you think? Or are they actually not going to leave Malaysia at all?
So I don't think it has to do with the excitement. They weren't introduced as a solution to the palm oil or as a particularly good or healthy or sustainable alternative. They actually came about because of the EU's ban on commodities that are linked to deforestation, and Malaysia was just worried about its reputational setbacks, and in a way, it just became a sort of like diversion thing because China's panda diplomacy is so famous and welcomed at the moment. They didn't predict the backlash that they would have from environmental activists saying, "Hey, you can't just take your orangutans outside of their environments and just give them to trading partners however you see fit."
I think it's so funny, the idea that they think they're going to get a win from just, handing out orangutans. It's. I mean, I suppose with the pandas, it's clearly worked, but as an idea, it's very odd.
And as the EU is regulating against palm oil, Mariana, where else might Malaysia turn to internationally for, positive relations?
So actually, Malaysia is trying to join the BRICS, so the group of larger emerging economies. There's been this whole debate because Malaysia has been usually associated with the G7, so the more developed economies. And there's this idea there might be some competition. Also that Malaysia might not be as interested or as invested in the ASEAN, the other association in which they're part of. But it's been very much part of the agenda as the Malay Prime Minister is now visiting India for the first time since 2022. And palm oil is one of the big things on the table, but also semiconductors. So there's a way in which the EU might be alienating Malaysia when it comes to deforestation efforts and so on, but it might have wider implications as to what path Malaysia chooses to follow in a more multipolar order.
So BRICS, we've talked about them before, but for those who are new to the acronym, so that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Is that right?
Yes, and as of 2024, it also includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE.
BRICS Plus. Okay. But the point is, Jess, if you have a rival consortium of countries to a group like the G7 or the EU, then those groups can make noises to try and stop you doing things with palm oil, but then you can go and find other friends, and between you create a whole new market anyway, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, so Russia and India are some of the biggest importers of palm oil from Malaysia and just globally in general. And I would argue that they probably don't have as high standards on how those products are produced. So yeah, I mean, you'll find buyers for it wherever you go, probably.
Mariana, what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, it sounds like the orangutans are not going anywhere. It does sound like Malaysia is trying different approaches, seeing all the backlash that it had with this diplomacy initiative. And they're now offering also tax exemptions for people who donate to their conservation fund. It also sounds like there are some issues around the timber production and also associated with deforestation. The EU is now backing out of its initiative. I would say this is a good way of keeping an eye on actually raising awareness for palm oil and its presence, but also what does it mean for the UK? Can it do better with its sustainable sources as well?
Okay. Still to come, Jessica, our resident environmental windbag, talks turbines. That's next. Okay, Jessica, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has the offshore wind industry figured out how to stay afloat?
The federal government declared floating wind as the 5th U.S. Earthshot, as a key technology to meet our climate goals as well as our energy goals as a country. With 3% of the Gulf of Maine surface area, we can heat every home and drive every car in Maine. That's how big the resource is. Now let's move that to the country as a whole. In the United States, there's enough offshore wind capacity within 50 miles of the U.S. shores to power the country 4 times over.
Dr. Habib Darga, Professor of Civil and Structural Engineering at the University of Maine, speaking to the Associated Press. Jessica, wind turbines. What's happened this week?
This week, the Biden administration gave the green light to the state of Maine to build a research site in the Atlantic where scientists will study floating offshore wind turbines. And they'll be building, I think, 12 of them. And they will be studying whether or not these turbines can sort of coexist with the ocean, the ecosystems, what impact they have, how they behave. And these are floating, right? So these are very different from regular offshore wind turbines that we're familiar with that are physically anchored to the bottom of the seabed.
Yeah, so on the video we were just seeing, I mean, that was in a swimming pool, right? It looked like like when they're filming a sequence in a movie and they're pretending it's the sea, it looked like there's just a tank. And in that, it can float on the top. It looks pretty flimsy.
Well, it probably looks flimsy because the one you were looking at was the size of, it was like 3 feet tall. But these are much bigger. They're much bigger and presumably they're much sturdier. They do move around on the top of the waves, right? So they can sort of move with the motion of the ocean, but they are tethered to the bottom with big cables. So there are big cables that come from the platform where the turbine stands, and the cables go down and connect to the bottom connect to the seabed.
So there's basically a few little anchors around them rather than a big pole going all the way down. Essentially, that's the difference, right?
Yes, in simple terms, yeah.
Yeah. They look like, I mean, if you're trying to get a visual picture of this, they do still look like windmill-shaped things, right? Because people hear the word turbine and imagine something industrial, but these are windmills that float.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And are they the future, Jessica? Why is this important?
This will be the first time that the US has been really studying floating wind turbines. And floating wind turbines, I would argue, are sort of the future of the wind industry and are going to be a huge player in terms of harnessing clean energy going forward. Because currently offshore wind is limited, right? So in order to use an offshore wind turbine, you have to put it in relatively shallow water. If you want to connect the whole thing to the floor of the ocean or whatever body of water you're working with.
Which is often why they're not as offshore as they sound, right? You can see them as you sail away from the country.
You can see them. That's right. You can see them. It's also quite limiting, right? Because only a certain percentage of the world's water is shallow. There are huge swathes of the ocean that are very, very deep. And what floating offshore wind turbines do is they open up all of that area to potentially being a place where you can harness offshore wind energy. And it has the benefit of being much more powerful winds the farther out you go. You can build taller and get the faster wind that you get as you build up. And they're also, you can't see them. So it kind of helps to overcome this sort of cultural barrier that people have of not wanting to see or know that there are wind turbines anywhere near them. So aside from being able to open up huge amounts of land or of sea to potentially being used to harness energy, it could hopefully, do so without making people angry.
Yeah, it could resolve, Leaf, the windmill NIMBY issue.
I know, yeah. I mean, I would like to say that surveys do indicate that in general, people are not as anti-wind turbine as perhaps you might think from reading the papers. People do in the UK quite like them. And one of the reasons why the UK is such a leader in kind of secure wind turbines is that we have lovely shallow waters for sort of, large stretches of sea. And one of the things, when Jessica brought up the story, I actually thought stupidly that these were like wind turbines that actually sort of migrate, that they're always on the move. They're like kind of peripatetic, but actually they are pretty much like normal wind turbines in the sense that, they are in sort of one place, even if the surface of the kind of the bottom of the platform does kind of go with the flow of the water a little bit, like basically bob up and down. They are fixed in place. I mean, I suppose it's worth getting a sense of how big these things are. There is a floating a small kind of wind farm off Scotland, and there's an interesting diagram of it. It was made by Equinor, the big energy company, and the sort of stalk bit under the water is roughly the height of Big Ben. So there's the turbine bit at the top, and then there's a long stalk bit that sticks down, doesn't touch the bottom of the sea, obviously, and then that stalk bit is kind of secured by these three kind of cables. So they are massive structures, and I'd be interested to know whether there are limitations on how deep the water is, because surely at some point, if you're having to put the cables 3 miles deep or 2 miles deep, that must be actually quite difficult, even for, energy companies that are used to going really deep.
And Mariana, I wonder from an international relations perspective, like who owns the wind? Who owns the sea? If you put them in the middle of the ocean, is it just a case of whichever country paid to put them out gets to harvest it? But then Jess was outlining a situation where in the future, perhaps there'll be more energy being harvested from offshore wind than a country even needs anyway. So then what do they do with the surplus? Does that belong to them? Should they be bolstering developing nations? I mean, are we anywhere close to resolving those sorts of issues?
I don't think we are, but you do have the economic zone. So wherever you put the turbine will obviously belong to the territories under their sovereignty. But even from an international relations perspective, there's other countries working on this. Like we were mentioning that the UK has some, China has also developed unique floating wind turbine structures. And it does feel like there's a bit of like muscle flexing, who is investing more in the turbines. And it seems like a very experimental thing at the moment. Like there are some that are working, but whether this is sustainable, and that especially at the scale at which the US is investing or promoting, it does sound like a bit of good PR. And it would be good to not forget that this was part of a promise that Joe Biden made at the beginning of his term, that the Interior Department had set a goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. It is an election year. So I feel a bit skeptical as to why the US is suddenly very, very interested in this, given that they only have a total of 7 shorter and bottom fixed turbines, so none of the floating ones. It does sound more like power projection at the time when China has just done something similar last month.
I do think the 7 number you cited of how many turbines we have in the US is outdated. We have quite a few more now because new wind farms are coming online now. But I do wonder if there's an element here to trying to like sort of brush under the rug the PR problems that offshore wind has had in the US lately. I don't know if you guys have seen, but there was this massive wind turbine blade that broke off of one of our first commercial scale wind farms about a month ago. It broke off and fell into the ocean, and pieces of it started washing ashore. And they had to close some of the busiest beaches in Nantucket at peak summertime tourist season. So that has been a huge problem, and it has brought down opinions on offshore wind. So offshore wind in general is in trouble, and there are projections now that show that we are nowhere near meeting President Biden's goals in terms of wind power. So I'm sure there is a little bit of PR situation happening here, but I also do think that there is huge potential here, and I think that this is just a research phase. And they have also said it's not going to actually be built for another couple of years. And this whole floating wind industry is very early days. I mean, there are like 4 small scale floating wind farms in the world, and they are very small scale. Like I said, they don't produce a ton of energy. There are more coming online. One thing that I thought was really interesting was that Norway has one of the largest offshore floating wind farms in the world, and it sends all of its energy to nearby oil and gas fields.
Wow. I mean, I suppose, Lee, from our perspective, finally, here in the UK, we are a windy place. You know, if anyone's going to benefit from this technology, it would be us with not that much space left on land that people want developed, lots of ocean all around us. We're an island.
I think it is good. I mean, the more people pile in and get competitive about this technology, floating wind turbines, the better for the UK, because we want to go out as much as we can so that we can stop people from getting annoyed about the fact that their beautiful views of the sea are kind of filled with white sort of flower looking things. But yeah, we are a really good wind producer, and also we use more energy in the winter. That's not necessarily unusual, but some countries that are very heavily reliant on, say, air conditioning, that's not quite as much of a case. So it's windier in the winter when we actually need the energy. So yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic for the UK. I'd also say that we have massively ambitious targets with wind, with the new Labour government, that they've said that they'd like to quadruple offshore wind by 2030. 2030 is like 5 seconds away. I find it kind of, I'm slightly skeptical about this goal. They also want to double onshore wind by 2030. I don't think that necessarily the floating turbines is going to make up a huge part of this quadrupling of offshore wind goal, because as we've said, it's really still early days. But, the better and the quicker the technology gets, the more we stand to benefit as a windy place.
Okay. Up next, why next year's summer holiday might cost you even more. That's after this. Lee, if you're finishing the show, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
More checks and more bureaucracy.
If you are planning on travelling to the EU in 2025 and you come from the UK, Canada, USA, Australia and a bunch of other countries, you may need to apply for an ETIAS before you travel. This is the European Travel Information and Authorization System. If you've been to the USA in the past 15 years, it's very similar to their ESTA system, which has been in place since 2009.
TikToker Kylie, not the Kylie, obviously, but the Kylie behind the account England and Everywhere in a video from Saturday. Leave, some of us will have heard about this story vaguely, some will have missed it completely. It will impact all of us planning to go on holiday to Europe next summer. So tell us, what's happened this week?
So the EU has said that it's going to introduce this €7 or £6 EU visa waiver from next summer. So it's looking like it's going to be in about May. And under this new sort of system, you're going to have to apply on your phone before you, say, board your flight or even in the weeks before. Say you're going on holiday to, I don't know, Paris, you'd have to fill out this form. And on that form, you're going to have to answer questions about, you provide your address, provide the place where you're going, and also make sure that you fill out bits about your criminal record. And it's part of an attempt by the EU to try and reduce security threats in the EU and basically keep a tag on who is actually in the bloc. And I think it's going to cause some headaches, but it's an interesting new development.
But the point is, you don't have to fill in that form if you're French and you're travelling from France to Germany. You only have to fill it in if you're British and you're travelling into the EU.
Unfortunately, yes.
Or from other countries that aren't in the EU. But anyone who's not in the EU has to fill out this form.
Yeah, and actually, it's not anyone who's not in the EU. It's the countries where you don't have to have a visa to travel to the EU. So that's a lot of countries. That includes the States, lots of other places. So we are in a lucky club. We're not having to actually apply for a serious visa every time we go to the EU, for which I'm grateful. But at the same time, it is going to be a bit of a ball ache, I think, sadly.
It seems most similar, Jessica, to the ESTA form that you have to fill out when you go to the United States. Do you have to fill in one of those as someone with a US passport?
No, I don't, because I travel back to the States on my American passport, and my kids don't either because they also have American passports. My husband, however, does not have an American passport. He has a British passport, and he does have to apply for an ESTA. And I think those last 2 years. And we were making a trip back to the States a few years ago, and we got to the airport and we were checking in, and we thought we'd left loads of time for our flight, and the flight attendant or whoever was checking us in said, your ESTA is out of date and you need to reapply for it
As you were checking in?
Yeah. She said, actually, this happens a lot. And she said it should be approved within like half an hour or something. But she said, or it could take 3 days. So we'll see. Go ahead and apply now. So it was probably the most stressful hour of my life. I think it took about an hour after we had made the application for us to get the approval. It wasn't that we were worried about whether or not he would be approved. It was just, will we make the flight? And we did, and it was fine. But the ESTA program has been in place since 2008. And again, it's supposed to do something similar. It's supposed to track more closely who's coming in and out. And it's done quite a good job at flagging security risks. I read that they have denied more than 4,000 applications since it launched in 2008. On the grounds of vetting against suspected terrorist watch lists. And then they've also denied more than 22,000 applications from people who were applying using passports that had been reported as either lost or stolen. So these are clearly like bad actors who are trying to get in. And this program is helping to keep them out.
And I presume, Mariana, you're feeling quite jammy about this with your EU passport.
Hey, I'm feeling absolutely fine. It feels great. Because I have the settled status as well. I come back, they say welcome home. When I go to the UK, it's all good for me. But I do sympathize a lot more with the sort of like, if the new EU system is anything like the ESTA, which some of my team and I have to do whenever we travel for conferences with the journal, it just happens that sometimes my Portuguese passport will get approved, but my colleague's Hungarian one won't get approved. And we don't really know why. All we have to do sort of, if you go through the ESTA, you tick a box that says you are not interested in committing terrorism or genocide. I cannot believe that my colleague ticked the box the wrong way. But it's sort of like, you don't really know why they go through or they don't go through. And the fact that I think the news are actually good news, guys. It means that you have a waiver and it lasts 3 years.
Yeah.
And you just have to do it every 3 years or when it expires. I mean, if you know about the loops that people have to jump through to get a visa for either the UK or the Schengen space, I think all of them would be very happy to pay €7 or £6 to get a waiver as well.
Well, this is the point, isn't it, Leaf? And I think I speak for a lot of people listening now. We've kind of outlined what the story is. I don't mind spending an extra €7. That's the same cost as 2 cups of coffee on my Ryanair flight, right? I don't mind even applying in advance, especially younger people who are very used to applying online for things won't feel scared by that. The issue is the delay when you get there. That's the thing that, especially as a dad traveling with my kids, if I'm only going away for a week, if I have to wait an extra 45, 50, 55 minutes at the airport to get through that line like you do when you go to the United States, that is a significant impact on my holiday.
Yes. And you know what I think it gets to the heart of is I've had a total, along with the rest of the country, a kind of crisis of faith in the ability of people to do their jobs efficiently, in sort of airport situations, on trains, in all sorts of places where things used to work quite smoothly. Why this is a concern is that I have very little faith for this to be implemented with any kind of smoothness. It's worth saying 2 things. One is that people under the age of 18 and over the age of 70 will not have to have this visa. So if you go on holiday with your children, you won't have to spend 7 times, however many children you have.
They don't have to pay for it, but I think they still have to apply, don't they? They have to go and say how old they are and who they are. So you still have to get on your phone.
Yeah, but you don't have to pay, which is, which will, if you have a large family, it will add, people are budgeting for their holidays and it will add something. It would have added something. And the second thing to bear in mind is that the EU has said it's going to use its discretion when this scheme is introduced next year. So the great fear is that you'll turn up and you'll have had a really busy week and you won't have applied for the ETIAS or the ETIAS, and that you'll just, you'll be declined and you won't be allowed to go on your holiday. But it looks like they might be a bit sort of flexible with it. So I'm really hoping that they will show discretion and be really nice about the people who are stressed and haven't managed to fill out their form on time.
Or you're travelling for work, Jess. I mean, actually, that can happen in our line of work, can't it? If you're a journalist covering a story and your visa's lapsed and suddenly you think, oh God, I've got to get on a flight to Paris, that might not be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, though, the point is that it's meant to be very quick and easy to do, similarly to what happened with my husband. You should be able to apply very quickly and you should be approved within a few hours. I think that's how it should go. I mean, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. I'm a little bit worried about this discretionary thing. I mean, you're seeing it as a good thing, it as a good thing, Leaf. I'm seeing it more as do you really want to be behind the guy who forgot to apply and then lands somewhere and has to argue with the border patrol agent about why they should be let in? That's going to add lots of time to our travel. I read somewhere that it was estimated to be adding something like 2 to 3 minutes to each person's travel. So I'm a little bit worried about it. I hope that they do a really good blast of information to people saying you must apply for this before you leave. Have you done this? And I think in the way they do it in the States, or when you're traveling to the States, is they make sure that the airlines do it before you even get on the plane. So you won't even be able to land in the States without an ESTA. So I don't know. There are a lot of things that could go wrong. It will rely very heavily on whether or not it is implemented well. We'll see.
It's worth us just quickly talking about the other thing that's coming in on the 10th of November, something very similar called the entry-exit system. And this could also bring in some delays when you're, trying to go on a holiday in the EU, and that's going to involve a kind of an eye scan and a photo of you as you're trying to enter the EU. So there are concerns that this EES, as it's being called, is going to cause delays, particularly at UK ports like sort of Folkestone, and sort of if you're traveling on the Eurostar, that the scanning thing that we're going to have to all do, and again it will apply. You have to do it once, then you don't have to do it every single time. But it's also going to add delays. So I suppose I'm a little bit worried that with this kind of deadly combo of thing, these 2 separate things could lead to some delays.
Yeah. I mean, my summer holiday this year to Germany was via Harwich on a boat. And so all of our check-in procedure, all of our passport check-in and everything happened from the car window, like a drive-through. They're not going to be able to scan my eyes that way, are they?
I don't know. They might. They will get their machines out.
We did actually scan the dog. They gave us a scanner through the window and we had to scan our own dog.
No way.
But Mariana, I mean, I've seen some people commentating, particularly in some of the right-leaning media outlets, that this could actually be a punitive measure from the EU because of Brexit. You know, they hate Brexit. This is a punitive thing on us. They're not doing it for Norway. They're not doing it for Switzerland. This is something that they're taking out on us, and we should return the favour and make sure that people coming from the EU have to go through similar controls when they come to Britain. Do you hold any store in that?
I think we're forgetting that the whole system was agreed to 10 years ago while the UK was still part of the EU. So as far as the UK is concerned, if we were all these problems that we've talked about, which are frankly first world problems about the line taking 2 minutes instead of 45 seconds, if we genuinely had the concern about this for everyone else that has to go through this, that doesn't live inside Fortress Europe, then we wouldn't have agreed to this at the beginning as UK citizens. Suddenly, when the UK has to play by the same rules, it somehow becomes the singular victim. I just think it's a really precious, rare talent that the media, that the right-wing leaning media has to just portray this as an attack on the UK. I don't see any ships coming onto the shore. I just, what are you being attacked for 2 minutes? You can sign a waiver so you don't have to do it.
But also people obviously leave. And finally on this, we want to start rehashing all of Brexit again. But obviously people who voted Remain as well feel this is punitive. You know, this is your fault for voting Brexit, right?
I had a good laugh. One of the Times wrote this story up, and beneath the story, I love reading the Times comments because they're quite waspish often. And one of the comments that had gone wild and people had really recommended it was saying people who voted Leave should have to, you know, do the paperwork and get their eyes scanned, but we Remainers, and you know, and I can see that it does add a sense, you know, for Remainers, a sense of like, what has Brexit ever done for us other than increase, you know, the amount of paperwork we have to do and, you know, slightly hold back our economy, etc. So yeah, I do think it's a case where Remainers are going to be feeling particularly morose, and actually you see it at airports where, you know, the people with EU passports will swan through, no queues, happy days, and then all the people without EU passports are standing there looking miserable and bitching about Brexit still. So I think it's only going to add to that sense of resentment.
I suppose bitching about Brexit at least gives us something to do in the airport queues. That's it. My thanks to Leif and Jess and Mariana. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. You can listen to it in an airport queue until they tell you to put your phone away. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Pearce at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.